Hello, welcome to the Behavioral Finance Dialogues on Corona Crisis video series. My name is Gulnur Muradoglu. I'm a professor of finance and the director of the Behavioral Finance Working Group. I work for the School of Business and Management of Queen Mary University of London. Today, I will be speaking to my colleague, Professor Arman Eshraghi from Cardiff University. We will discuss supermarket runs and bank runs and why do people run. If you enjoy this video, please share it and subscribe to the Queen Mary University of London YouTube channel. And please come back and listen to the other talks in the series.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for coming to the Behavioral Finance Dialogues. I'm going to start.
With pleasure.
We were both very concerned when we observed the supermarket runs at the beginning of the Corona crisis. So
yes.
We decided to work together on those supermarket runs. Now, can you tell us why people run and how it relates to the bank runs in financial crisis?
Absolutely. So the fundamental reasons why people panic are pretty similar when you look at periods of financial turmoil. And we have had many examples of this in the past. So in essence, when the economy is starting to suffer or collapse, or when there is bad news, it's completely visceral to the nature of the human beings to run for the door. And what we're observing right now is a health epidemic or pandemic where obviously there's a virus spreading, so there's the contagion of the physiological elements, but there's also the contagion of fear. And in some sense, the fear is spreading faster than the virus, you could say.
And I think sometimes fear is more contagious than the virus itself, isn't it?
Absolutely.
In the first wave of contagion during the supermarket runs, people were afraid, and they were afraid of death, they were afraid of hunger. So how do you explain that? I mean, the supply chains were pretty resilient, but still that didn't stop spreading.
Yes, so the fear in itself is an instinct. Some psychologists refer to it as an instinct. I think the reason why it kicks in is particularly interesting in cases of volatility. So if you look at the volatility that happened in financial markets recently, since the start of the epidemic, that in itself is an indication of the fear, of course, but psychologically, when there is uncertainty, when there is very vague, when there's a very vague outlook for the future, it is more our emotional response which kicks in rather than the more calculative, thoughtful responses to events in out there. And as you know very well, Gulnur, in our field, in behavioral finance, experts talk about the fast brain and the slow brain, system 1 versus system 2. And exactly it is in these situations where, unfortunately, system 1 seems to take over. So your fast brain, your automatic, trigger-happy brain tends to respond to stimuli faster than your calculative, effortful thinking brain. And this, I think, clearly has happened in the past, so it's not a new news, but with reference to this particular event, I think because it has touched so many people's lives, including many investors, but their family members, it's just so different from everything that has happened in the past. Because with other financial turmoils that have happened, if you're an average investor, well, the worst thing that can happen is that you would lose some investments. But with this particular one, it is your job on the line, potentially your livelihood, those of your loved ones and your children, and so on. And for those reasons, I think we have seen far more dramatic reactions from the financial markets, from the investors. And you can add to that other biases in behavioral finance, which I think are manifesting themselves, including, for example, herding. So when panic sets in, then the incentive to herd again takes over. So you see two people running for the door and you want to be the third person and not the fourth person. And I think that's clearly, again, showing itself. Also, there's been just so much news about the virus and about the financial and economic consequences that again, the average person out there is bombarded with so much news. If you compare this with normal times when waters are calmer, you get to hear about the economy and the stock market maybe once a day or a couple of times a week, but now you're constantly hearing about this. And because of what we, again, in our area call the recency bias or the representativeness, I think what happens is all this news attacks you and you don't have time to digest it. So you're more likely to rely on the last thing you heard or the most recent thing you heard about it. And it just becomes more challenging to see the big picture. And I think this in itself, again, psychologically adds to the overreaction and to the more dramatic responses we're seeing in financial markets. So there's a whole minefield, isn't it?
It is a whole minefield, isn't it? Yeah. So, I mean, we've seen a lot of biases at work. Sometimes they're lifesavers. You know, the quick mind, the quick operation, the quick immediate response to a risk. Sometimes it's a lifesaver, but sometimes it creates additional risk. I think in the supermarket case, yes, there was fear. Yes, there was recency bias, and there was availability bias as well. About a week or two before the supermarket runs, almost exclusively, we heard about the deadliness of the virus, how deadly the virus was, how quickly it spread, and how we should save the NHS, we should save the vulnerable people. Everyone felt, I think, the urge to do something. And then, well, there isn't much that the regular person can do to stop the virus spreading. All we can do is to slow it down. But at the same time, doing something maybe meant going to the supermarket, stocking the house so that you don't go out for about 3 months, 2 months, or however the length of the time is, you know, using the money on your card. But on the downside of this panic behavior, the fear behavior, was the risk that was imposed by breaking the supply chains.
Absolutely.
There is no problem on the supply chain, but there is no way that 3 months stock can be provided in 1 day or 3 days. Every system works as a system and can be resilient as a system, but at the same time, if you run the system crashes.
That's very true.
There was a risk on the supermarket chain and there was a risk on the food chains, that those chains, only because of the runs, could halt or could be damaged. So that was a risk that we couldn't somehow mitigate. It took time for the supermarkets to mitigate it by making the announcements that they can feed the nation, there is enough, just pace out. And they introduced the queues in front of the supermarkets, and they introduced priorities to vulnerable portions of the population, to NHS workers, etc. And that's how this crisis, an additional crisis to the corona crisis, was somehow mitigated. But that was, I think that was phase 1 of the economic crisis coming through a coronavirus, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yes, I agree. And we might see further repercussions as we go on. You're right. In fact, in the project we're working together, we're drawing parallels between these sorts of runs and the runs on financial institutions that we are more familiar with, perhaps. I think it's also important to bear in mind the differences between this crisis and, for example, the financial crisis of 2008, um, uh, which has implications for what we're discussing right now. So with 2008, what we saw was a sector-specific crisis. So you could argue it was the property sector, which then led on to financial sector and through securitization, but ultimately it was contained, and it was more of a big institution crisis. Whereas now we have indeed an economic crisis which has spilled over to so many different sectors of the economy, and it's difficult to pinpoint. Of course, there are certain sectors which are more damaged than others, but it's just the breadth of this is not comparable, I think, to the breadth of the financial crisis. And for those reasons, again, I think the reactions of the average people around us are just more visceral. So you want to put food on the table, and food is such a such an important commodity, and so you're absolutely right. I think the reactions led to further pressure on the supply chain systems, which were already under pressure, and that's. But nevertheless, thankfully, they've shown resilience, and
yes, they were very resilient. You're right. I mean, the supply chains were extremely resilient, and I think we were very lucky because the supply chains kind of like resisted the run, and they did manage to get through the run in a very successful manner. And I also think that you're right in mentioning the nature of this crisis being different from the 2008 crisis. So this is mainly a demand-induced crisis, and it's mainly in the real sector rather than the financial sector.
Absolutely.
Or we cannot easily predict the repercussions. But at the same time, being demand-induced and being induced by the shutdowns in the economy, I think the fears of death and the fears of hunger were escalated.
Very true.
People took it as something to do with their behaviors, wanted to adopt their behaviors, change the spread of the virus, and to protect themselves from death and to protect themselves from hunger. And both of them are very fundamental instincts.
You're absolutely right.
Human instincts, isn't it?
Absolutely. And also closely related to regret aversion, because you always think, should supermarkets shut down for any reason, I'm going to feel deep regret if I've never been there to collect, for example, whatever it is that I want to pick up. So there's that regret, the fear of missing out, as we know. So there are all those pressures which can explain why we saw in the early days the supermarket runs that we saw.
Yes, very correct. There was a lot of regret aversion as well, and maybe we'll see similar biases. Maybe we'll see different biases in the future as the corona crisis unfolds.
Absolutely. But best wishes for the remaining days, and
yes, best wishes for the remaining days, and we'll get through it very quickly.
Thank you. It was lovely seeing you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye-bye. Cheers.